My brother died today. It was our mother who found him. After years of fighting depression, of heartbreaks, and trusted loved ones' betrayal, he had finally had enough. He went out as bloody as possible. It took one bullet, one tiny piece of metal, to end a lifetime's worth of misery. I walked into the house hearing the agonizing screams of our mother. I ran up the stairs and into his room. I saw her holding her baby, begging him to breathe. The blood, my God, the blood. It was everywhere. It was splattered on the wall behind her. It almost looked beautiful, all the red on the white wall, like an unfinished painting. It was all over our mother. She cradled his lifeless body, screaming over and over, "Breathe, please, breathe." It didn't take long for the ambulance and the cops to arrive. They had to pry our mother's hands off of him. She refused to let him go. I talked to the cops for hours. My mother was taken to the hospital suffering from shock. They quickly ruled out homicide when the prints on the gun came back to be his. I was oddly cold to the whole situation. He was my brother, and I loved him. But in the moment, I didn't feel anything. A form of shock, or maybe guilt. I returned back home. I decided to sleep on our couch in the living room on the first floor. I would have to pass his room to get to mine, and I wasn't ready. I tried to go to sleep. However, after a long day of feeling nothing, an emotion finally hit me. It wasn't sorrow or anger. It was fear. I was home alone, and yet, upstairs in his room, I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth. I had somehow fallen asleep. I woke early that morning to loud knocking on my door. I ignored the knocking and carefully listened for any noise upstairs. No footsteps. I blocked the footsteps from my mind. A nightmare, perhaps, I thought. After all, it was a long and traumatic day. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. "Shit," I muttered under my breath. It was her. My brother's girl. Well, ex-girlfriend. I didn't have the energy for this. I reluctantly opened the door. She just stared at me with tears in her eyes. I gave her that look, that, yes, it's true look. She burst into tears. Then I shocked myself. I burst into tears with her. We held each other and cried for what felt like ages. After some time, she stopped and looked at me with tears in her eyes still. I motioned for her to come inside. We walked over to the couch and sat down in silence, not looking at each other, both of us preoccupied with our own thoughts. Then she looked at me and said it. I knew it was coming. The same thought was going through my head all day. "You know this is our fault. We fucking killed him." "No," I finally said. "We fucked up, yeah, but we didn't kill him. We didn't put the gun to his head and pull the fucking trigger. He did that." "We might as well have," she replied. "Look, he always struggled with this, all his life. He's the one who gave up and ended it. He was the coward, not us," I yelled. "How can you say that?" she said, horrified. "Because it's the truth. He wasn't the only one who suffered. I suffered. You suffered. That's life. He chose to give up," I yelled. "That is exactly what cowards do." She paused before she spoke again. "You can call him a coward all you want to try and convince yourself, but you know as well as I do we are responsible for this," she said. My mind raced back to that night, just a few days before he died. She had been arguing with him again. In anger, he left the house. I came home to find her in the kitchen crying. Shit, they were fighting again, I thought. She looked at me and said, "I think we are officially over." Now, I always loved her, since we were kids. However, my brother did what I couldn't. I was always too scared to make a move. He went for it. I always resented him for it. That night, seeing her so hurt, I just wanted to be there for her. We eventually ended up in my room. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I had always dreamed of this moment. That night was the best night of my life. I was with many women before her, but nothing compared. I learned what it meant to truly love someone. To my disdain, I realized that night that I didn't just love her, I was in love with her. We fell asleep in each other's arms. This was a big mistake. I awoke the following morning with her still naked next to me. To my shock, I saw my brother standing over our bed, just staring, with a blank but cold face. She stayed with me the rest of the day. We didn't talk that much, but we were both still trying to accept that he was gone. My mind was racing. I felt a combination of emotions that day. First sorrow, then anger, but also slight happiness. Not because he was dead, but happy that she was here with me. She left in the afternoon to return home and get ready, and we had a service prepared for him in the morning. I was alone again. I decided to make a quick trip to the hospital in order to check on our mother. She had thankfully gotten over the shock and just entered the grieving phase. We sat and just cried together. "It's no one's fault, Ma. He always had issues," I quietly said. "I know, but still you wonder if anything could have been done. If maybe we didn't do enough," she replied. "Ma, he is gone. Nothing is going to change that. Don't punish yourself on what ifs. We have to just accept that he is gone." "It's just, she hesitated. My baby is gone." She started crying again. I knew it was too soon for words to make her feel any better. I just stayed by her side and let her cry. I returned home around 2 in the morning. I was a little nervous to be here alone. Would I hear the footsteps again? I sat on the couch, still not ready to go upstairs. There was an eerie silence. I breathed a sigh of relief. Better this silence than to hear footsteps. I got comfortable on the couch and slowly felt myself falling asleep. Right before I entered the dream world, I heard a faint but clear whisper ask,
"Do you really think I'm a coward?"
It was now the day of the funeral. I couldn't breathe. Everyone was there. Our parents, our old friends, even people I didn't recognize. Most important, she was there. There was so much sadness and tears, but I couldn't even cry with them. I could feel a panic attack take over me. She noticed and took my hand and squeezed. "I know it hurts, but I'm with you," she said. I looked at her and forced a smile. She didn't understand what I was dealing with. No one in that room did. I started sweating as my breathing became more and more rapid. All the eyes of the guests looked at me with sympathy. They thought I was just mourning my dead brother, but they couldn't see. I finally couldn't take it anymore. "Are you all blind?" I yelled. "Can none of you see it?" With all the confused and worried faces, I realized the truth. I was truly alone. None of them saw what was terrorizing me. My brother, my dead brother, was standing right next to his casket, smiling at me. It's been a few weeks since the funeral. I had not left my home since. I couldn't. She came to see me, bringing some groceries with her. "I know it's been hard on you, but you have to start trying to move on. Come outside with me. Let's go for a walk," she said. I stayed silent. I could see frustration building in her eyes. "Look," she said after some time of silence passed. "You're not the one who died. He is gone. The last thing he would want is for you to lock yourself up in here and slowly die. He would have wanted you to move on with your life." I stared at her. It broke my heart to see her hurt and that I was causing it. I was about to speak when he interrupted me.
"She is wrong. I don't want you to move on. I want you to suffer as I suffer. You're the reason I am dead. You are the reason I am still in agony even in death. I cannot rest, so neither will you," he
He coldly said. I just stared at his lifeless face, powerless to say or do anything. He was very pale, reflecting a body with no life in it. The right side of his head had the hole where the bullet had entered. He stared at me with his brown yet lifeless eyes, and he was always smiling an ear-to-ear smile. What started off as footsteps in the night turned into a nightmare that I couldn't escape. He was now always there, always smiling at me. I would go to bed and wake up in the mornings hoping he was gone. However, I was always greeted with a simple hello and that same demented smile. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry, I never meant to hurt you," I cried. "I loved you." "Don't apologize, you didn't hurt me," she replied. She thought I was talking to her. It wasn't her fault. She was oblivious to my brother's presence. I took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and told her, "I need help. I think I've been hallucinating." It's been 3 weeks since I've been in the hospital. They put me on many different medications, none of which worked. I was starting to get fed up with being here. He was still always there. He rarely talked. He would just stand there, smiling that same evil smile. It's always harder to grieve properly when a loved one commits suicide. You have to accept that this wasn't your fault. You have to let go of this guilt. That guilt is why you keep seeing him, the therapist said. My brother stood right next to her, smiling and nodding his head in agreement. Another 2 weeks passed and still no results. More pills and sessions, and I still couldn't get rid of him. He was always there. His appearance kept slowly changing with time. His face continued to decompose. The skin on one side of his face was half peeled off and hanging. His teeth rotted quickly, going from yellow to black. His eyes were no longer the beautiful brown surrounded by white, but now completely black. But worst of all, he was always smiling, a hideous and wide smile.
"Look at me. Look what you did to me,"
he laughed. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," I cried.
"Make it right. Put us out of this misery,"
he coldly said. "How?" I knew the answer, but still stupidly asked.
"You know how. An eye for an eye. End both of our torment, dear brother,"
he sarcastically said. I curled up in my bed and cried myself to sleep. I checked myself out the next morning. I came into the hospital willingly, so they couldn't keep me against my will. They had their chance, but their pills made no difference. There was no help for me here. If medicine and science failed, maybe, just maybe, God could help me. I found myself standing in front of 2 bronze doors. My brother was now unrecognizable. He looked like a smiling corpse. Half of his jaw was missing flesh, exposing his tooth and bone. Half his skull was visible with just a few strands of hair on his head. His exposed bone still clearly showed the bullet hole, yet he was still always smiling his tormented smile.
"You can't get rid of me like this. We will still both suffer. Please set us free,"
he said. I ignored him and walked through the doors. Finally finding my courage, I took a deep breath and walked towards the priest. I explained to him everything. I told him about my brother's suicide and how he haunted me day and night. "Is he here now?" asked the priest. "Yes, he is standing right beside you," I quietly replied. The priest looked around, visibly uncomfortable. "Please help me. I don't know what else to do," I desperately asked. "I will do my best, but you have to put your complete faith in God. There can be no doubt. Surrender yourself to him, and he will guide you to salvation," he said. My brother laughed.
"Surrender? Sounds like he wants you to sell your soul,"
he smirked. I ignored him. "This isn't a possession, so an exorcism will not work. Besides, we would have to get approval from the church, and that could take weeks, the priest said. So what can we do? I asked. Pray. Pray to God for his protection and to ward off any evil spirits, he replied. We can start with the Lord's Prayer. Do you know it? I nodded my head. We started. Our Father, in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. My brother started to scream. Not in anger, but agony.
You already killed me and now you want to add to my misery?
He yelled out in desperation. It broke my heart to hear the pain in his voice, but I ignored him. I had to do this, to get rid of him. Maybe it would bring peace to both of us. The priest continued with a Roman prayer that I didn't know. I stood there, with eyes closed. Suddenly, the windows inside the church shattered and the wind came crashing in. With such power I never felt, I had to drop to the floor to avoid being blown away by the wind. My brother continued to scream out in agony, and terror now took over me. I was about to try and flee when the priest yelled out to me, "Remember, have faith, do not be scared." I looked at him and nodded. He continued his prayer. My brother finally stopped screaming and looked at me, the smile finally gone from his face.
Why do you hate me so much, brother?
He asked. I was about to answer when I remembered what the priest said. Faith. I had to have faith. I looked away from my brother and closed my eyes. And just like that, the wind died, and when I opened my eyes, my brother was nowhere in sight. I looked around in amazement and realized the broken windows had miraculously been repaired. I looked at the priest and quietly said, "He is gone." I fell back on the floor and wept, tears of happiness, but also tears of sorrow. My brother was finally gone. I made my way back home that night. This nightmare was finally over. I still had so many questions. What caused this? Was that thing even really my brother? And where's my brother now? In the moment, it didn't matter. I was just happy it was over. I decided to finally go to his room and clean the mess he'd left behind. I braced myself before opening the door, ready to see the terrible scene of blood everywhere. I took a deep breath and opened the door. In that moment, everything inside me broke beyond repair. I was mortified. Sitting on the bed, on the same spot where he died, was my brother with that same evil smile that was now ear to ear. Nothing was going to get rid of him. Not science and not religion. I realized there was only one way to stop this nightmare. I had to make things right. I went and got pills I had from the hospital and came back to the room and sat right next to him. An eye for an eye, right? I asked. He nodded.
Set both of us free, dear brother.
I swallowed all the pills in the bottle. I laid down next to him and let fate do the rest. I thought of her, the woman both my brother and I loved. I smiled. She still brought me some comfort. I thought of our poor mother, who would tragically have to bury another son. I could feel my heart beat slower and slower, and the world slowly started to fade. At least I soon would finally be able to rest. As the world got darker with each passing second, my brother slowly leaned over and whispered,
You will never find peace now. Just like me, you will suffer forever.
My eyes widened in terror, but before I could even say anything, I was engulfed by total darkness.